Chilwell, Nottinghamshire, England, 1915. The British Army was running out of ammunition. On the Western Front, soldiers were being told to ration their shells. 3 rounds per gun per day, sometimes less. The Germans were firing thousands. Britain was losing the war because it couldn't produce enough explosives. The government made a decision. Build the largest ammunition factory in the world. Build it fast. Make it produce more shells than anyone thought possible. They chose a site near Nottingham, flat land, good rail connections, far enough from the coast to be safe from German naval bombardment, close enough to cities to draw workers. The site was farmland in January 1915. By July, it was the largest industrial complex in Europe. The speed of construction was unprecedented. 12,000 workers. Working in shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They laid 50 miles of railway track inside the facility, built 300 buildings, installed machinery ordered from America before it was even designed, connected electrical systems that required their own power station. The factory covered 1,250 acres, nearly 2 square miles of industrial production, visible from space if satellites had existed. When it opened in July 1915, the government set an ambitious target: 100,000 shells per week. Military planners thought this was optimistic. Engineers thought it was impossible. Within 6 months, Chilwell was producing 1 million shells per week, not 100,000, 1 million, 10 times the original target. More ammunition than the entire British Empire had produced in any previous year, from a single facility. This is the story of the National Shell Filling Factory, Chilwell, the factory that won World War I, the place where women did what men said couldn't be done. 1914. Britain entered World War I in August. The military believed it would be over by Christmas. A short war, mobile warfare, cavalry charges and infantry advances. They were catastrophically wrong. By October, the Western Front had stabilized into trench warfare. 450 miles of trenches from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Millions of men facing each other across a few hundred yards of mud. And the war became about artillery, not glamorous cavalry charges, not heroic infantry assaults. Artillery. Massive guns firing shells weighing hundreds of pounds, thousands of rounds per day, pulverizing enemy trenches before infantry attacks. The problem was simple. Britain didn't have enough shells. Before the war, British shell production was modest, maybe 50,000 shells per month, enough for colonial conflicts, enough for limited European engagements, not enough for industrial warfare. By spring 1915, the crisis was acute. British artillery officers were receiving orders to limit fire. The shell crisis became a political scandal. Newspapers demanded action. The government fell. David Lloyd George became Minister of Munitions. His mandate was simple: produce more shells, whatever it takes. Lloyd George understood the problem wasn't just increasing production, it was revolutionizing it. Traditional munitions factories were small, skilled craftsmen making shells one at a time. Quality control was manual. Production was limited by available skilled workers. This couldn't scale. Lloyd George proposed something radical: apply industrial mass production techniques to shell manufacture, build enormous factories, use unskilled labor, automate wherever possible, standardize everything. It was the Henry Ford model applied to explosives. The first challenge was finding workers. Skilled male workers were in the trenches. The men who remained were either too old, too young, or in essential industries. The solution was obvious: women. In 1915, women didn't work in heavy industry. They didn't work with explosives. They didn't work with dangerous machinery. Social conventions said they couldn't. Physical limitations said they couldn't. Union rules said they wouldn't. Lloyd George ignored all of it. We need workers. Women can work. Women will work. The unions protested. This would undermine male wages. It would destroy traditional gender roles. It was dangerous. Lloyd George made a deal. Women would be paid less than men for the same work. Their employment would be temporary, only for the war. After the war, men would get their jobs back. The unions agreed, reluctantly, but they agreed. Recruitment began. The government needed 30,000 women to staff Chilwell. They got 100,000 applicants. Most had never worked outside the home. Some had never worked at all. They came from farms, from shops, from domestic service. They came because the pay was good. They came because their country needed them. They came because it was an adventure. The first group arrived at Chilwell in July 1915. They looked at the massive factory complex with a mixture of awe and terror. Buildings stretching to the horizon, machinery they'd never seen, tasks they didn't understand, and explosives everywhere. The training was minimal. A few days' instruction, basic safety procedures, how to operate specific machines. Then onto the production floor. The factory was organized as an assembly line. Revolutionary for 1915. Empty shell casings arrived by rail from foundries. Steel cylinders, each weighing 40 to 80 pounds. Perfectly machined, but empty. The shells moved through the factory on conveyor systems. Each station performed one specific task: precision, repetition, speed. Station 1, inspection. Women checked each shell casing for defects, cracks, imperfections, dimensional errors. Rejected shells went back to the foundry. Accepted shells moved forward. Station 2, cleaning. The casings were washed in chemical baths. Any oil or residue removed. Clean metal was essential for proper explosive adhesion. Station 3, first filling. This was where it became dangerous. The shells were filled with explosive compounds, TNT mostly. Also amatol, a mixture of TNT and ammonium nitrate. The women worked in rooms kept deliberately cold. Explosives are temperature sensitive. Heat could cause spontaneous detonation. The rooms were kept at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The women worked in winter coats even in summer. They ladled molten explosive into the shells. Carefully, precisely. Any air pockets could cause premature detonation. Any overfilling could cause the shell to explode when fired. The room was silent except for machinery. No talking. No sudden movements. Total concentration. One mistake, and everyone in the room died. Station 4, cooling. The filled shells moved to cooling rooms. The explosive needed to solidify completely. This took hours. Temperature and humidity had to be precisely controlled. Station 5, second filling. Many shells required multiple explosive layers, different compounds for different effects. The process repeated. Station 6, fusing. The detonator mechanisms were installed. Incredibly delicate work. The fuse had to arm during flight, but not detonate prematurely. Tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Station 7, final inspection. Each completed shell was checked. Weight, dimensions, fuse installation. Any defect meant the shell was disassembled and reprocessed. Station 8, packaging. Approved shells were packed in wooden crates, 12 shells per crate, each crate labelled with production date, inspector number, explosive type. Station 9, shipping. The crates moved by rail to ports, then by ship to France, then by rail again to ammunition dumps behind the lines, then by truck to artillery batteries. from factory floor to firing position in 10 days. The entire process required perfect coordination, thousands of workers performing specific tasks, each task dependent on the previous one. Any breakdown stopped the entire line, and it worked. By September 1915, Chilwell was producing 200,000 shells per week. By December, 500,000. By March 1916, 1 million. The numbers were staggering. 1 million shells per week meant 142,000 per day, 6,000 per hour, 100 per minute, nearly 2 shells every second. The factory never stopped. 3 shifts of workers, each shift 8 hours. The machinery ran continuously. The workers came and went, but the factory kept producing, day and night, summer and winter. Through air raid warnings and equipment failures and accidents, always producing. The human cost was substantial. The women who worked with explosives developed distinctive symptoms. Their skin turned yellow from TNT exposure. Not figuratively. Actually yellow. Jaundiced appearance from toxic absorption through the skin. They were called canary girls. The yellow skin was a badge of pride. It meant you were doing essential war work. It also meant you were being slowly poisoned. TNT exposure caused multiple health problems, liver damage, kidney dysfunction, anemia. In severe cases, toxic jaundice led to death. The factory medical staff tracked these cases. Workers showing severe symptoms were rotated to different duties, away from direct explosive contact, but the damage was often permanent. After the war, many canary girls died young, liver failure, cancer, organ damage from years of toxic exposure. Their sacrifice was as real as any soldier's, less visible, less honoured, but equally costly. The work was also physically demanding. Shells weighing 40 to 80 pounds, lifted hundreds of times per shift. Back injuries were common, hernias, repetitive strain injuries. The factory floor was dangerous, moving machinery, conveyor systems, heavy objects in motion. Accidents happened, fingers caught in machines, crushed hands, broken bones, burns from hot metal and chemicals. The factory hospital treated dozens of injuries every day, minor cuts and bruises, serious trauma, chemical burns, and occasionally deaths. The most dangerous work was in the explosive filling rooms. Any mistake could trigger a detonation, and explosives are unforgiving. Small accidents happened weekly. A spilled container of TNT, an improperly sealed shell, a spark from static electricity. These usually resulted in small fires, quickly extinguished. Production temporarily halted, then resumed. But everyone knew a major accident was possible. When you're working with explosives, it's not if, but when. July 1st, 1918. 10:50 p.m., Section 42 of the factory. The night shift was in full operation. A shell being filled with TNT somehow ignited. The exact cause was never determined. Static electricity, maybe. A defective shell casing. Human error. It didn't matter. The shell detonated. 40 pounds of high explosive. In a room filled with workers and more shells. The initial explosion killed 8 women instantly, but that was just the beginning. The blast triggered secondary explosions, dozens of shells detonating in chain reaction. The building disintegrated. Fragments of metal and concrete became shrapnel. The explosions spread to adjacent buildings. More shells detonating, more workers killed. Fire broke out, spreading through wooden structures, more explosive materials igniting. The factory fire brigade responded, but the explosions continued. Buildings collapsing, fire spreading, more secondary detonations. The chaos lasted for hours, explosions shaking the ground miles away. flames visible from Nottingham 10 miles distant, smoke rising thousands of feet into the night sky. By morning, the fire was contained. The explosions had stopped. The damage assessment began. Section 42 was completely destroyed, nothing but crater and rubble. 6 adjacent buildings heavily damaged. 2 more completely collapsed. And the bodies. 134 workers killed, mostly women. Some men from the fire brigade and maintenance crews, ages ranging from 16 to 58. Another 250 injured, many critically. Burns, shrapnel wounds, blast trauma. It was the worst industrial accident in British history. 134, dead in a single night, all doing war work, all volunteers, all heroes. The government investigation concluded it was an unavoidable accident. The nature of explosive manufacturing meant disasters would occasionally occur. Safety procedures were adequate. No negligence was found. This was technically true, but it was also an evasion. The real cause was speed, the pressure to produce more shells faster, shortcuts taken to maintain production quotas, safety procedures relaxed to save time. The factory was producing 1 million shells per week because it was pushing every limit: technical limits, safety limits, human limits. And sometimes pushing limits has consequences. The victims were buried with military honours. Their families received pensions. The nation mourned. And the factory resumed production 3 days later. This seems callous, heartless even. Restarting production before the bodies were even buried. But the war didn't stop for mourning. The Western Front consumed ammunition at an insatiable rate. Every day without production meant soldiers in trenches without shells, meant artillery batteries rationing fire, meant lives lost because of inadequate firepower. The women of Chilwell understood this. They returned to work, to the same buildings, the same machinery, the same risks, because the alternative was abandoning the soldiers at the front. This is the moral complexity of industrial warfare. Production workers faced death to provide weapons. Their sacrifice enabled soldiers to survive. The shells they made killed enemy soldiers, who were also someone's sons and brothers. There's no clean morality here, just necessity, just the brutal mathematics of total war. By August 1918, Chilwell had resumed full production, 1 million shells per week, despite the accident, despite the deaths, despite the trauma. The workers who survived the explosion worked alongside new recruits. They didn't talk about that night, couldn't talk about it. The memory was too fresh, the grief too raw. But they kept working. November 11th, 1918, 11 a.m., the armistice, the war was over. At Chilwell, the machinery stopped. For the first time since July 1915, the production line went silent. The conveyor belts stopped moving. The explosive filling rooms went still. The packaging stations emptied. 3 years and 4 months of continuous production ended in an instant. The workers stood in silence. Some cried. Some cheered. Most just stood there, processing what this meant. It was over. The war, the work, the danger, the purpose. They'd produced more than 170 million shells, 170 million, from a single factory, in 3 years. British artillery had fired approximately 9 million shells during the war. Chilwell had produced enough for nearly 20 wars of that scale. The surplus shells were stored. Massive ammunition dumps around Britain, just in case, just if needed. Some were eventually destroyed. Some were sold to Allied nations. Some sat in storage for decades. In World War II, some Chilwell shells were still being used. 25-year-old ammunition, still functional, still deadly. That's the quality of production these women achieved. After the armistice, the promises were kept. Women were dismissed. Men returning from the front got their jobs back. The factories converted to peacetime production or closed. Chilwell partially demobilized. Workforce reduced from 30,000 to 3,000. Most buildings shuttered, maintained in case of future need. The Canary Girls returned to their previous lives. Domestic service, shops, farms, homes. They didn't talk much about their war work, partly because it was classified, partly because nobody asked, partly because the experience was too complex to explain. How do you describe working with death for 3 years? How do you explain the fear of knowing any moment could be your last? How do you convey the pride of knowing your work mattered? You don't. You just return to normal life and carry the memories privately. The yellow skin faded, mostly. Some women retained a slight jaundiced tint for years, a permanent reminder. The health problems didn't fade. Liver damage was permanent. Organ dysfunction progressive. Cancer rates among Canary Girls were significantly elevated. Many died in their 30s and 40s, decades before their time. Casualties of the war that came home from the factory instead of the front. There were no pensions for toxic exposure, no compensation for industrial illness, no recognition of sacrifice. They'd done what their country asked, worked with deadly materials, risked their lives daily, developed chronic health problems, and were thanked with dismissal and forgotten. That's the bitter truth of the home front. The sacrifices were real, the dangers were real, the costs were real. But the recognition wasn't. The factory at Chilwell continued in reduced capacity through the 1920s and 1930s. When World War II began in 1939, production ramped up again, not to the same scale. Technology had advanced, other factories had been built, but Chilwell produced millions more shells for the Second World War. Different workers, different war, same purpose. The factory finally closed in 1968, 53 years after it opened. Half a century of ammunition production. Most of the buildings were demolished. The site was partially redeveloped. Some areas became industrial estates, some became residential. Today, little remains. A few buildings preserved as historical monuments, some foundations visible in fields, railway embankments now overgrown, and a memorial for the 134 workers who died in the 1918 explosion. A stone monument in a small park. Most people walk past without noticing, but the impact of Chilwell resonates through history. It proved that industrial mass production could be applied to warfare, that factories could produce weapons on previously unimaginable scales, that wars would be won not just by soldiers, but by industrial capacity. World War II would vindicate this lesson completely. American factories producing aircraft, tanks, ships at rates that dwarfed anything previously achieved. The Willow Run factory producing one B-24 bomber every hour. The Kaiser shipyards producing one Liberty ship every day. These were Chilwell's descendants, the logical evolution of what started in Nottingham in 1915. It also proved that women could do what society said they couldn't. Heavy industry, dangerous work, technical precision. The Canary Girls demonstrated this conclusively, not through rhetoric, through results. 1 million shells per week. Produced by women society said were too delicate for industrial work, produced with precision that military inspectors initially doubted women could achieve, produced under conditions that would have broken most men. After World War I, women got the vote, partially because of their war work. Their contribution had been undeniable, their capability proven. You can't tell women they're not capable of heavy work after they've produced 170 million shells. You can't claim they're too fragile after they've worked with deadly explosives for 3 years. You can't deny them political rights after they've demonstrated such competence. The path from Chilwell to suffrage is direct. The factory also established the template for total war, the idea that entire nations mobilize for conflict, that civilians become essential to military success, that the home front matters as much as the battlefront. In World War II, this became standard. Women in factories, rationing, strategic bombing of industrial capacity, targeting production as much as armies. Chilwell pioneered this. The shells produced at Chilwell killed hundreds of thousands. German soldiers, Austrian soldiers, Turkish soldiers. Each shell was designed to kill. Many succeeded. The women who made these shells knew this. They weren't naive. They understood what they were producing. Weapons, specifically designed for killing. Some struggled with this morally, reconciling their role as life-givers, mothers, potential mothers, with their work creating death. Others justified it simply. The soldiers at the front needed ammunition, providing it saved British lives. The German soldiers would kill British soldiers if given the chance. Therefore, producing shells was defensive. Others didn't think about it at all. It was work. It paid well. It was necessary. The moral complexity could be processed later, or never. There's no easy answer to the ethics of arms production. Is it moral to produce weapons? Depends on who's using them and why. In this case, the shells were used to defeat Imperial Germany, a militaristic power that had invaded Belgium and France. That had started the war. That needed to be stopped. From that perspective, producing shells was moral, necessary, justified. But the shells still killed people. Young men, conscripts mostly, who hadn't chosen the war any more than British conscripts had. The moral ledger doesn't balance cleanly. The women of Chilwell produced 170 million shells. This enabled Britain to sustain artillery operations throughout the war. This contributed significantly to Allied victory. This saved British lives. This ended a destructive war. This also killed hundreds of thousands of people. Both things are true. The factory that produced 1 million shells a week was simultaneously an engine of salvation and an instrument of death. That's the paradox of industrial warfare. The same capacity that saves your soldiers kills the enemy's soldiers. The same precision that protects your troops ensures deadly accuracy against others. There's no moral purity here, just choices between difficult alternatives. Britain could have produced fewer shells, rationed ammunition, fought a limited war. Result, more British casualties, longer war, possibly defeat. Britain chose to maximize production, build the largest ammunition factory in the world, produce shells at unprecedented rates. Result, the ability to sustain artillery operations, eventual victory, but massive casualties on both sides. Which choice is more moral? Limiting production and accepting higher friendly casualties, maximizing production and inflicting higher enemy casualties? There's no clear answer, just trade-offs. The women of Chilwell made their choice. They went to work. They produced shells. They accepted the risks. They endured the health consequences. Some gave their lives, not because they gloried in warfare, not because they enjoyed killing, because they believed it was necessary. And maybe it was. World War I was terrible, but German victory might have been worse. Imperial Germany's war aims included permanent occupation of Belgium and northeastern France, annexation of territory, economic domination of Europe. Stopping this required defeating German military power, Defeating German military power required artillery. Artillery required shells. Shells required factories. Factories required workers. The chain of necessity is unbroken. The women at Chilwell were essential links in that chain. Remove them and the chain breaks. Remove their production and Britain loses. This doesn't erase the moral complexity, but it provides context. They didn't produce shells because they loved war. They produced shells because the alternative was losing. And in 1915, losing meant German victory, which meant continued aggression, continued militarism, continued conflict. So they worked, in cold rooms filled with explosives, handling deadly chemicals, operating dangerous machinery, risking their lives daily. For 3 years and 4 months, 1 million shells per week, every week, week after week, for 171 weeks. The scale is almost incomprehensible. Imagine 1 million of anything. Now imagine producing that every 7 days. Now imagine each item is a precision-engineered explosive device. Now imagine doing this with 1915 technology. The achievement is staggering. It required perfect organization, flawless logistics, continuous innovation, unwavering determination, and 30,000 workers, most of them women, most of them with no previous industrial experience. They learned on the job, mastered complex tasks in days, achieved precision that experts thought impossible for untrained workers, maintained quality control while producing at incredible speed. The initial skepticism was enormous. Military officers didn't believe women could handle explosives safely. Engineers didn't think unskilled workers could maintain quality standards. Industrialists doubted that mass production could work for precision munitions. All of them were wrong. The women of Chilwell proved it, not with arguments, with results. 1 million shells per week, meeting all specifications, passing all inspections, functioning perfectly in combat. British artillery officers sent letters praising the ammunition, consistent quality, reliable performance, superior to pre-war production in many aspects. These letters reached Chilwell, were posted on factory bulletin boards. The workers took pride in them. They knew their work mattered. They knew soldiers' lives depended on shell quality. They knew a defective shell could kill friendly troops. So they maintained standards, even when exhausted. Even when production pressure increased, even when shortcuts beckoned, because soldiers were counting on them. This sense of purpose sustained them through difficult times, through exhaustion, through danger, through tedium. The work was simultaneously terrifying and boring. Terrifying because of the constant danger, boring because of the repetition. Fill shell, inspect shell, move shell, repeat, 1,000 times per shift. The same motion, the same task, hour after hour, day after day. It was mind-numbing, but it couldn't be mindless. One moment of inattention could be fatal. So they stayed alert, stayed focused, stayed careful for 8 hours, then went home, slept, returned, did it again. 3 shifts of workers, rotating through continuously. The factory never stopped. Christmas Day, Easter, birthdays, anniversaries. Didn't matter. The factory operated. Someone was always working. The shells didn't stop flowing. By 1917, Chilwell shells were being fired on the Western Front at rates of 1 million per week, the same rate they were being produced. Perfect synchronization. Production matched consumption. The pipeline was balanced. This is logistics at its finest. Coordinating production, transport, storage, and usage across thousands of miles. Timing everything perfectly. Ensuring ammunition arrived when and where needed. It required unprecedented coordination. between factory managers and military planners, between rail companies and port authorities, between supply officers and artillery commanders. And it worked. British artillery never ran short after Chilwell reached full production. The shell crisis of 1915 never recurred. Artillery could fire without rationing. This changed battlefield tactics. Artillery became the dominant weapon, massive barrages before infantry attacks, continuous harassment fire, counter-battery fire against enemy guns, the Battle of the Somme in 1916. British artillery fired 1.5 million shells in the opening barrage, 7 days of continuous fire, 200,000 shells per day. Most of them came from Chilwell. The Battle of Passchendaele in 1917, 4.5 million shells fired over 3 months, 50,000 shells per day, every day for 3 months. Chilwell supplied the majority. The 100 Days Offensive in 1918, the final push that broke German resistance, continuous artillery support, unlimited ammunition. Fire missions executed without concern for supply, possible because of Chilwell. The factory didn't just support British military operations, it enabled them. Without Chilwell's production, Britain couldn't have sustained offensive operations, couldn't have maintained artillery dominance, couldn't have broken the stalemate. The factory was as essential as the army, perhaps more essential. Armies without ammunition are mobs. Artillery without shells are sculptures. Wars without industrial production are impossible. Chilwell provided the industrial production. The women who worked there were as crucial to victory as any general, as any soldier, as any strategist. They didn't command armies. They didn't plan operations. They didn't fight battles. They made it possible for others to do those things. That's the reality of modern warfare. Victory belongs to industrial powers, to nations that can mobilize production, to societies that can sustain effort. Chilwell demonstrated this conclusively. After World War I, every major power learned the lesson. Build industrial capacity, prepare for mass production, mobilize the entire population. World War II would be won by industrial powers. America's production capacity, Soviet factory output, British mobilization against nations with less capacity, Germany stretched thin, Japan isolated and blockaded. Industrial capacity determined victory. Chilwell pioneered this reality. The factory that produced 1 million shells per week changed warfare forever, not through innovation in weapons, through innovation in production. The shells themselves weren't revolutionary. Standard artillery ammunition, conventional explosives, proven designs. The revolution was in quantity, producing so many, so quickly, so reliably. This is how industrial nations fight, not with better weapons necessarily, with more weapons, overwhelming quantity, sustained production, continuous supply. The women of Chilwell mastered this. 30,000 workers producing what seemed impossible, maintaining pace that exhausted everyone, sustaining effort for 3 years. They changed history, not dramatically, not obviously, quietly, 1 shell at a time, 1 million shells per week, 170 million shells total, each one a small piece of Allied victory. Together, an avalanche that buried German resistance. That's the power of industrial production. That's the legacy of Chilwell. That's the achievement of the Canary Girls. 1 million shells per week, every week, for 3 years. The factory that won the war. The women who made it possible. The sacrifice nobody remembers, except in a small memorial in Nottinghamshire, where 134 names are carved in stone, where flowers are occasionally left, where history whispers if you listen carefully. The factory that produced 1 million shells per week, Remember it. Remember them. Remember that wars are won in factories as much as battlefields. And remember that the workers who made victory possible were women. Society said couldn't do the job. They did it anyway. They proved everyone wrong. They changed warfare forever. 1 million shells per week. 170 million shells total. 134 lives lost. Countless lives saved. That's the mathematics of Chilwell. That's the legacy of the Canary Girls. That's the factory that won World War I. But the numbers alone don't capture the human reality, the daily experience of 30,000 workers, the individual stories behind the statistics. Mary was 19 when she started at Chilwell, from a farm in Derbyshire. She'd milked cows and harvested wheat. Now she was filling shells with TNT. The transition was jarring, from open fields to enclosed factory floors, from natural rhythms to mechanical precision, from peaceful work to constant danger. Her first day she was terrified. The building was enormous. The machinery was loud. The explosives were everywhere. A supervisor showed her the filling station. Ladle the explosive into the shell. Fill to this line exactly. Any air pockets and the shell won't detonate properly. Any overfilling and it might explode in the gun. Mary's hands shook as she lifted her first ladle. Molten TNT, yellowish liquid, hot enough to burn, explosive enough to kill. She poured carefully, watching the level rise in the shell casing. Stopped exactly at the line. Perfect. Good, the supervisor said. Now do that 600 more times today. 600 shells per shift, 1 every 48 seconds, for 8 hours. Mary thought she couldn't do it. She was wrong. By the end of the week, she was hitting quota. By the end of the month, she could do it almost without thinking. Almost, but never quite. Because thinking about it kept you alive. The rhythm became automatic. Ladle, pour, check level, move to next shell. Repeat. Her hands developed calluses from handling the ladle. Her back ached from bending over shells. Her feet hurt from standing all day. And her skin turned yellow. The TNT absorbed through her skin despite precautions, despite gloves, despite washing. The yellow tint started on her hands, spread to her face. Her entire body took on a jaundiced appearance. She looked at herself in the mirror, barely recognized the face looking back. Yellow skin, exhausted eyes, a stranger wearing her features. But she kept working, because the alternative was quitting, and quitting meant the shells didn't get made, and soldiers died without ammunition. So she worked, like 30,000 others. Each with their own story, each making the same choice. Margaret was 35, a widow with 3 children. Her husband died at Ypres in 1915. She needed work that paid enough to feed her family. Chilwell paid better than anything else available, £4 per week, more than she'd ever earned, enough to rent a decent house, enough to feed her children properly, enough to save a little. But the work was hard, harder than she'd expected. The hours were long, the danger was real, the exhaustion was total. She worked the night shift, midnight to 8 a.m., came home as her children left for school, slept while they were gone, woke up to make them dinner, left for work as they went to bed. She saw them for maybe 30 minutes a day, sometimes less. Her oldest daughter, 14, managed the household. Cooked breakfast, got her siblings to school, handled shopping, put them to bed. She was forced to grow up fast, forced to be responsible beyond her years, forced to become the adult because her mother was busy making shells. Margaret felt guilty about this, felt like she was failing as a mother. Her children needed her. But the country needed shells. Her family needed money. The mathematics of necessity. No good choices. Just less bad ones. She kept working. Elizabeth was 17, from a wealthy family in London. She didn't need the money. She volunteered because her brother was at the front. Her parents were horrified. Their daughter working in a factory, with common women, doing manual labour, handling explosives. Unthinkable. Elizabeth went anyway. She wanted to contribute. Wanted to feel like she was doing something. Wanted to share the burden. The other women at Chilwell didn't trust her at first. Rich girl playing at being a worker. She'd quit when the work got hard. She didn't belong. Elizabeth proved them wrong. She worked as hard as anyone, handled the same dangers, developed the same yellow skin, endured the same exhaustion. After a few weeks, the other women accepted her, not as a rich girl, as a worker, one of them. She lasted 2 years at Chilwell. Then her parents pulled strings, got her transferred to less dangerous work, office work in London. Elizabeth didn't want to leave. She felt like she was abandoning her colleagues, but her parents insisted, and they had the influence to enforce their will. She left in tears, feeling like a failure, feeling like she'd let everyone down. The women she worked with didn't blame her. They understood. Parents want to protect their children. Rich parents have the power to do it. But they missed her. She'd been a good worker, a good colleague. Class didn't matter on the factory floor, only reliability. These were just 3 stories. There were 30,000 more, each unique, each compelling, each representing a human being making difficult choices. The factory operated on a strict schedule. Shift changes were precisely timed, 7 a.m., 3 p.m., 11 p.m. Workers arriving and departing in massive waves. Special trains ran from Nottingham to the factory, packed with workers, standing room only. Everyone pressed together. The trains were segregated, men in some cars, women in others, not officially. Just by habit. The women talked during the commute about work, about families, about the war news, about everything except the danger. They didn't discuss the risk, didn't acknowledge that any shift might be their last, didn't mention the constant fear. Talking about it made it real, made it harder to endure. So they talked about other things, normal things, safe things. The trains arrived at the factory siding. Workers disembarked, walked to the changing rooms, put on factory clothes, stored personal items, then to the factory floor. The handover between shifts was brief. Outgoing workers reported any problems, equipment issues, quality control concerns, production status. Incoming workers took over mid-task. The production line never stopped. Shells in progress completed by the new shift. Seamless transition. The factory operated like an organism. Individual workers like cells, coming and going. But the whole continued functioning. This required extraordinary organization, tracking which worker was at which station, ensuring every position was covered, managing breaks without stopping production. Supervisors choreographed the ballet, moving workers between stations, covering absences, maintaining flow. It was exhausting for them too. Constant attention, continuous problem-solving, no breaks. The factory contained its own world, medical facilities, canteens, restrooms, even a small shop. Workers could theoretically stay on site for days. Some did during emergencies, working double shifts when production demands spiked. The canteen served thousands of meals per day, simple food, stew, bread, tea, nothing fancy, but hot and plentiful, subsidized by the government. Workers paid pennies. The food was necessary. The work was physically demanding, burned calories at tremendous rates. Workers needed fuel. The medical facilities treated constant minor injuries, cuts, bruises, strains, burns, and monitored for toxic exposure, regular blood tests, checking liver function, screening for severe cases. Workers showing dangerous symptoms were rotated out, moved to less toxic areas, given time to recover, then usually returned to explosive handling, because they needed the workers, couldn't afford to lose experienced people. The production quotas demanded every available hand. The factory had its own rhythm, different from outside life. Time measured in shells produced. Progress marked in quotas met. Weekly targets posted in every building. Current production tracked hourly. Everyone knew if they were ahead or behind. When behind, pressure increased. Work faster, shorter breaks, less conversation. When ahead, slight relaxation, still working hard. But the pressure eased marginally. The competition between shifts was intense. Each wanted the highest production numbers. Pride in productivity, recognition for achievement. The factory newspaper posted top performers, individuals who exceeded quotas, sections with perfect safety records, achievements celebrated publicly. Workers clipped these articles, saved them, sent them to family members. Proof that their work mattered, recognition of their contribution, validation of their sacrifice. The technology at Chilwell was cutting edge for 1915. Electric conveyors, automated machinery, precision tools, much of it designed specifically for the factory, custom equipment, purpose-built machines, engineering innovations. The filling machines were particularly sophisticated. Heated reservoirs maintained explosives at precise temperatures. Pumping systems delivered exact amounts. Sensors detected air pockets. Automatic shutoffs prevented overfilling. These machines were ahead of their time, anticipating automation that wouldn't become standard until decades later. The quality control systems were equally advanced. Every shell inspected multiple times. Dimensional measurements verified mechanically. Weight checked to fractions of an ounce. X-ray examination for internal defects. X-ray technology was brand new in 1915. Chilwell was one of the first factories to use it industrially. Revolutionary application, ensuring shell quality impossible to verify visually. The rejected shells were recycled, explosive removed, casings returned to foundries, everything reused, nothing wasted. Materials were too valuable, production too important, efficiency critical. The factory's railway system was a marvel. 50 miles of track, multiple spurs to every building, continuous movement of materials. Small electric locomotives pulled trains of shells, thousands per hour, moving from building to building, station to station. The rail system required its own staff, engineers, conductors, track maintenance workers, keeping the trains running, maintaining the infrastructure, ensuring continuous flow. Any breakdown stopped production, so maintenance was obsessive, preventive rather than reactive. Equipment serviced constantly. The factory's power requirements were enormous. Its own electrical generating station, coal-fired, producing megawatts continuously. The coal arrived by rail, trainloads daily, fed into furnaces, keeping the power flowing. The power plant workers were men, one of the few all-male areas of the factory. Hot, dirty, dangerous work, maintaining the boilers, managing the generators, ensuring reliable power. Without them, the factory stopped. No power meant no production. So, they were essential as the women filling shells. The factory operated its own fire brigade, specially trained, equipped for explosive fires, stationed throughout the complex. They practiced constantly, drills every week, simulated emergencies, prepared for the worst. July 1st, 1918 proved their training wasn't enough. The explosion overwhelmed them. Too much fire, too many secondary explosions, too much chaos. They tried anyway, ran toward the flames, attempted to contain the fire. Some died trying. Their bodies were found alongside the women they tried to save. All counted as casualties, all honored equally. The aftermath of the explosion changed everything. The sense of invulnerability shattered. Everyone knew the danger was real, but knowing abstractly is different from seeing the bodies. The survivors had nightmares. Some couldn't return to work. Psychological trauma, what we'd now call PTSD, but in 1918 there was no treatment, no counselling, no support services. Just the expectation that you'd cope and continue. Most did, not because they were stronger, because they had no choice. Bills needed paying. Families needed feeding. The war continued, so they returned to the factory, to the buildings where colleagues had died, to the work that had killed them, and kept producing shells. The factory's safety procedures improved after the explosion. More inspections, additional fail-safes, better fire suppression. But everyone knew it could happen again. Working with explosives meant accepting risk. No amount of safety procedures eliminated it, only reduced it. The choice was clear. Accept the risk and continue, or quit and leave soldiers without ammunition. They accepted the risk. The shell crisis of 1915 had been political as well as military. It brought down Asquith's government, created the Ministry of Munitions, forced Britain to confront its unpreparedness. Chilwell was the response, proof that Britain could industrialise warfare, demonstration of national capability, symbol of determination. Politicians visited regularly, inspecting production, posing with workers, giving speeches about national effort. The workers found these visits annoying. Politicians got in the way, disrupted production, asked stupid questions, but they were politically necessary, showing the public that government was acting, demonstrating that the shell crisis was solved, building support for continued mobilisation. Winston Churchill visited in 1917, then Minister of Munitions. He walked the factory floor, watched the production process, spoke with workers. He was impressed. "This factory," he said, "is worth 10 divisions, perhaps 20. He meant it. Artillery without shells is useless. Divisions without artillery support can't attack. Chilwell made offensive operations possible. His quote appeared in newspapers. Chilwell worth 20 divisions. The workers clipped the article, saved it. Proof of their importance. King George V visited in 1918, royal recognition. The women were told to curtsy, to address him properly, to be on best behaviour. The king walked through the factory, looking uncomfortable, clearly out of his element, but doing his duty. He pinned medals on several workers, recognition for long service, for production achievements, for bravery during the explosion response. The recipients were embarrassed, but pleased. Royal recognition was rare, unprecedented for factory workers, validation of their importance. After the king left, production resumed. The visit had been a disruption, cost several hours of production, thousands of shells not made. But the morale boost was valuable. The workers felt seen, felt appreciated, felt recognized. That mattered. The factory's cultural impact was significant. It changed perceptions of women's capabilities, demonstrated that gender limitations were social, not biological, proved that women could handle anything men could. After the war, this became part of the suffrage argument. Women who'd produced shells deserved the vote. Women who'd kept the country running during war deserved political rights. Women who'd proven their capability deserved equality. The Representation of the People Act 1918 gave some women the vote, women over 30 who met property requirements, not full equality, but progress. Chilwell contributed to this, not directly, but by changing perceptions, by proving capability, by demonstrating strength. The factory also changed British industry, demonstrated the power of mass production, showed that skilled work could be broken into simple tasks, proved that organisation could overcome skill limitations. These lessons were applied post-war: automobile manufacturing, consumer goods, any industry requiring scale. Chilwell was a template. The factory's impact on ammunition production was global. Other nations copied the model. France built similar facilities. America built larger ones. The American Springfield Armory, the French Rouen Arsenal, the Italian Turin complex, all followed Chilwell's example. Mass production, unskilled labour, systematic organisation. By World War II, this was standard. Every major power had enormous ammunition factories. American production dwarfed even Chilwell. Soviet output was staggering, but Chilwell pioneered the model. First, to prove it could work. First, to demonstrate the scale possible. First, to show that workers once considered incapable could achieve the impossible. The technology developed at Chilwell influenced military production for decades. Automated filling machines, quality control systems, logistics coordination. These innovations spread beyond ammunition, applied to aircraft production, shipbuilding, tank manufacturing, World War II production miracles. American factories producing incredible quantities. Soviet factories relocated and restarted in months. British production sustained under bombing. All built on lessons learned at Chilwell. The human cost of Chilwell extended far beyond the explosion victims. The toxic exposure effects lasted decades. Cancer rates, liver disease, reproductive problems. Many canary girls couldn't have children. TNT exposure damaged reproductive systems, caused miscarriages, birth defects. These effects weren't tracked officially. No studies, no compensation, no recognition. The women suffered privately. Another cost of their service. Another sacrifice unrecognized. Some canary girls formed support groups after the war, meeting monthly, sharing experiences, supporting each other. These groups lasted into the 1960s. As members aged and died, eventually too few remained. The groups dissolved. The last known canary girl died in 1996, aged 98. She'd worked at Chilwell for 18 months, then 78 more years carrying the memories. Her obituary mentioned her war work briefly. She served at a munitions factory during the Great War. No details, no recognition of what that meant. Just a single sentence. That's how most canary girls were remembered. Briefly, vaguely, incompletely. The factory site today is mostly redeveloped. Housing estates, industrial parks, shopping areas. A few original buildings remain, preserved as historic sites, open occasionally for tours, rarely visited. The memorial to the explosion victims stands in a small park, well maintained. Flowers appear occasionally. Remembrance Day services held annually, but most people don't know it's there, walk past without noticing, unaware of what happened, unaware of who's commemorated. The railway lines are mostly gone, track removed, embankments overgrown, bridges demolished, but if you know where to look, you can see traces, concrete foundations, drainage systems, slight depressions in fields where buildings stood. archaeological remnants, physical evidence of history, slowly disappearing. One of the preserved buildings houses a small museum, photographs of workers, sample shells, machinery exhibits. Visitors are sparse, school groups occasionally, history enthusiasts sometimes, mostly empty. The museum struggles for funding. Local council support is minimal. Public interest is limited, slowly deteriorating. This is how history fades, not with dramatic destruction, with quiet neglect, with funding cuts and deferred maintenance and public indifference. But the story deserves better. The women deserve better. The sacrifice deserves recognition. 1 million shells per week, every week, for 3 years and 4 months. 134 workers killed in a single night. Thousands more suffering health effects for decades. 30,000 women doing what society said they couldn't. That's not a footnote. That's not a minor detail. That's essential history. The factory that produced 1 million shells per week changed warfare, changed industry, changed society, changed history. The women who made it possible were heroes, not the dramatic battlefield kind, the quiet, persistent kind. The kind that shows up every day and does impossible work under terrible conditions because it needs to be done. They weren't saints. They were paid for their work. Many did it for economic reasons. Some resented the necessity, but they did it. That's what matters. Not motivation, action. They produced 170 million shells, enabled British artillery operations, contributed decisively to Allied victory, saved countless lives, at tremendous personal cost, health destroyed, lives disrupted, some dying young, all carrying the burden. This is what total war means. Entire societies mobilized, everyone contributing, everyone sacrificing. The soldiers at the front get remembered, their names on memorials, their stories in history books, their sacrifice honored. The workers who made victory possible are forgotten. A memorial in a small park, a museum nobody visits, names fading from memory. This is unjust. The sacrifice was real. The contribution was essential. The recognition should match, but it doesn't, and probably never will, because factory work isn't dramatic, doesn't make good stories, doesn't inspire paintings or poems, just numbers. 1 million shells per week, cold statistics, impersonal data. But behind every number is a person. Behind every shell is someone who made it. Behind every statistic is a human story. 30,000 stories, most now lost. No one left to tell them. No records preserving them. Just the shells. And the memory of what those shells enabled. The factory that produced 1 million shells per week. The women who made the impossible possible. The sacrifice that won the war. Remember it. Remember them. Tell the story. Because if we don't, who will? The last canary girl is gone. The witnesses are dead. The buildings mostly demolished. Only the story remains, and the choice whether to tell it. This is that story. Incomplete, imperfect, but true. 1 million shells per week. 170 million shells total. 3 years and 4 months of production. 30,000 workers. 134 dead. Thousands more with damaged health. These are the numbers. Behind them are people. Mary with her yellow hands. Margaret with her motherless nights. Elizabeth with her privileged guilt. And thousands more whose names we'll never know. Each made a choice. To work. To endure. To sacrifice. Each contributed to victory. Each deserves recognition. Each should be remembered. The factory that produced 1 million shells per week won World War I. The women who made it possible are heroes. Their story is our history, And history, once forgotten, is lost forever. So remember Chilwell. Remember the Canary Girls. Remember that wars are won by ordinary people doing extraordinary things, not always on battlefields, sometimes in factories, sometimes at workstations, sometimes one shell at a time, 1 million shells per week, every week, for 3 years, the factory that changed history, the women who changed the world, the sacrifice we must never forget. This is their story. This is their memorial. This is their legacy. 1 million shells per week, and the people who made it possible, 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 who made it possible.